Hey everyone, thank you for coming out, and thank you for everyone on the live stream. My name's Alex, and I'm the organizer for Nashville Data Nerds. Today we have Sam Lawson and Julia Romano.
Yes, perfect.
Coming to speak about the ideal scooter density in Nashville, which is kind of, I think, a hot topic on a lot of people's minds. I'd like to also thank Belmont in general for providing us a place to meet, and IO Studio for being awesome sponsors and bringing us a delicious Chick-fil-A. So before we get started, I'd love to have IO Studio come up and speak for a little bit, tell us about them, and then we'll get started.
Computer real quick, are you projecting up there at all? If you can, it's cool.
Yeah, if you want to come up, we can get you
Yeah, here, I can disconnect mine.
Yeah. Do you have HDMI?
I just need a USB-C connection.
I think we got that.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally.
I did not plan anything elaborate, so this will take literally 2 minutes. I might have a connector in the bag. If we don't have a connector, I can just speak about it.
If you just speak, I'll send all the slides out.
That's fine, and there's no slides. I was just going to pull up our website and that kind of thing. So if you guys wanted to check out more about us, on the IO Studio website, we have a capabilities section, and we have a engineering department. So a little bit about me, and then how I ended up at IO Studio. So I'm the vice president of technology at IO Studio. I've been a software engineer for about 15 years as a contractor. Worked for a lot of different companies, and I've seen the rise of data and how important that is. So one thing I really like about what we're doing at IO Studio is we really take this data first approach whenever we're working with clients. So IO Studio, if you don't know who they are, been in Nashville for about 15 years. We do a lot of strategic planning, and we're a creative agency, so we do a lot of digital advertising, marketing. Also, we have a full-blown call center in Nashville. Some of our employees are remote. We do a lot of government work. We do a lot of commercial work as well. Our biggest clients right now are in the government space. So what we do for the National Guard, so if you go to the nationalguard.com website, my team runs that website. We are basically the funnel for recruiting. So anybody that's wanting to join the military goes to the website, finds out all about it, fills out the form. Our infrastructure basically tracks any lead generation. So we have various vendors where the government spends millions of dollars every year hiring different marketing entities. We process all of that, and we track all of that return on investment, and we report monthly to the National Guard. Here's how your money's being spent, and then here's where it's not effective. Here's where it is effective. So we have a huge need to prove to the government that their dollars are being spent correctly. So data's a big part of that. Since I've been at IO Studio, we've been really trying to change the quality of our reporting. So we're really focused on building out our data engineering and our data analytics department. So we wanted to get back involved in the community. My history in Nashville is I've always sponsored and run my own user groups as well, because we need to help each other out and get to know the community and find people we trust and people that are good at our jobs. So all that being said, I'll quit with the spiel. We have about 10 people on our engineering team. On top of that, we do have a data analytics and strategy department that we're looking to find more people to grow with us. So we're actually looking for contractors. And then if that turns into full-time employment, great. If it doesn't, but we're kind of at that tipping point where we need really good people to work with us. And if you end up liking our culture and working with us on some of the projects we work on, then we would make that a more of a long-term relationship, you know. So come date us and see if you like us, and then marry us later, so to speak. So anyway, thanks a lot. If you guys want to contact me, I'll be hanging out afterwards or whatever, but we'd love to get to know the community and let me know if there's anything we can do for you guys.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Well, like before we get started here, you know, kind of like Alex said, my name is Sam Lawson. My partner Julie Romano. We're presenting this scooter analysis we did for Nashville Software School. I'd just like to thank Alex for inviting us, Data Nerds for inviting us, having us here in Belmont for the space as well, and IO Studio for sponsoring too. So, let's see. Before we get started, I just want to kind of give like a little background and context in case like anybody's not 100% familiar with like the scooter issue, I guess, in Nashville. Late 2018, all these companies started bringing scooters in Nashville. So they kind of placed them in like high population area centers around, you know, mainly downtown, the Gulch, places like that. And people would kind of, you know, if they want to get from one place to another, maybe not drive there, but kind of get there faster than walking, kind of pay per ride model. They just, you know, swipe your card, hop on a scooter, there you go, you know. So get from one place to another like that. You read the bills when this first started happening at Metro, there's really a lot of like excitement about all the opportunity that would come with this. You know, you got new business coming in, and it would also allow for Metro Nashville to like accomplish a lot of their transportation goals, especially in regards to traffic congestion. You know, I know that's a hot topic. I feel like everywhere I go, like somebody's always complaining about traffic, you know, around here, right? So that was like a real big, you know, point of emphasis for them, so cut down on congestion, give people a way. We'll talk a little bit about last mile transportation. So what that is basically, you know, your last kind of mile really from getting from where you're at to a public transportation spot. You know, this would help out with that. So there's like a lot of areas here that the scooters would potentially help Metro Nashville accomplish a lot of their goals, and a lot of excitement for that too. And this picture I found the other day kind of like, I think summarizes kind of like the ideal goal in game, I guess. You know, basically kind of where I read the bills, the initial bills. I found this picture, I was like, man, this is kind of like everything it seems like they wanted, you know. You got a bright sunny day out. Instead of maybe taking your car to go from wherever and sitting in traffic, you know, being frustrated, getting there, just you and your pal hop on your scooter, flash those new sunglasses you got, and just kind of enjoy the day, you know, instead of maybe just sitting behind your wheel and just being frustrated all day. And while you're doing that, you know, you're helping, you know, maybe there's any environmental concerns that you have or, you know, Metro has, you're kind of like helping solve the problem that they want to solve too. So I just, you know, saw that, thought it was cool, wanted to place it in there. But then, so, you know, you got the ideal end game for all this. Maybe, you know, some of you guys are familiar with all this, probably didn't exactly work out like that. There are a lot of issues that arise with the scooters in Nashville, particularly around just the sheer number of them. I don't think anybody expected at the start that, you know, oh my God, there's like, you know, seemingly 10,000 scooters around Nashville in one area. People weren't great at kind of like parking them in the appropriate area. I remember like, you know, I worked in the Gulch at the time, so like there would always be a scooter on the street just like, you know, in the way basically. A lot of congestion, a lot of safety concerns. See right here, got you know, a bunch of about 43 related scooter accidents in April 2019 alone. I think Vanderbilt reported approximately one serious head trauma case related to scooters per month during that time frame as well. And then, as some of y'all know, kind of like the tipping point for all this came in May. On May 19th, somebody actually died from a scooter accident. They got hit by a vehicle, passed away from their injuries. That caused like a huge uproar in the community. And so that basically, you know, kind of like forced the issue of like, you know, we need to do something about this. It's really at that point kind of the wild, wild west, the way I looked at it, is where there's all this stuff going on, not really a whole lot of regulation. People are just kind of, you know, getting hurt all the time. You know, everything's not going according as planned. And some bills were actually introduced, you know, just 6 months prior, there's all this excitement around scooters, right? And then now here we are, and it's like Bills gets introduced, we just need no scooters whatsoever, right? So in that short time frame, kind of like goes from one extreme to the complete opposite other. So our task with the data analysis was, you know, can we find, I guess, a happy medium of like so many scooters, you know, causing all these problems, but also, you know, so maybe cut down on the issues that we're having, but also still accomplish the goals that Metro Nashville wanted to do. We were tasked by Metro to analyze scooter usage in the months of May, June, and July 2019. At the time, there were 7 scooter companies operating in Nashville: Bird, Bolt Mobility, Lyft, Lime, Spin, Jump, and Gotcha. And then, obviously, given the notoriety and level of controversy surrounding the scooters at the time, this is really a great opportunity for us to kind of like accomplish our learning goals at Nashville Software School, but also help out in the community, really, and solve a really, obviously, big time, real world issue, and help out in that. Also like to point out, while me and Julia are like the 2 presenters on here, we're like part of a team of about 25 people that did this as well. So while we get the glory, I guess, of presenting this to you, there's a lot of hard work by a lot of other people that went into this at Nashville Software School. And we did this analysis using Python. A lot of the visualizations you're going to see were used with Matplotlib, Seaborn, and Folium in particular. Yeah, so framing our question, the main question we got from Nashville when they came to us was, you know, trying to find what's the ideal scooter density in Nashville. To give our best answer sets, still be able to analyze this stuff and come out with a correct answer. I see right here, here's all the like, you know, sizes of all the files we got, 1 file for each month. And here's just kind of a screenshot of what that initially looked like. They were initially sent as CSV files. 9 total columns, 4 float data types, 5 object data types. And this pub date time, you know, obviously that's a date time column, that was an object column, which is really, you know, I think that caused a lot of the issues, especially relating to size. But yeah, so there's just kind of like a screenshot of what we were initially working with. Some of our solutions that we had to overcome this, we stored the data to pickle files. So that cut our file size in half. And like what pickle files do, they store the objects as byte types, or like Python specific file types pretty much. So kind of like maximize efficiency and whatnot. And then to use, so an example, So like for an example, for the May data, to use .head on a pickle file took about 2 milliseconds. Before on the CSV file, it took 52 seconds to use .head on the, you know, on that. So just kind of an example of how great that was. Also using, you know, chunk size in a for loop with pd.readPickle. So instead of looking at all 2 million plus rows of the data at one time, kind of like waiting for all that to come through, you know, you can kind of like segment your data into maybe 10,000 rows at a time or 20,000 rows at a time, look at it that way, and then still be able to conduct a thorough analysis. Then also, showed before, we had like 9 total columns, I think. Some of those were unnecessary, we dropped those. We dropped some of the unnecessary rows too. Company definitely included e-bicycle data. We weren't really concerned with that, so we kind of deleted that. It wasn't necessary for this analysis. Whatnot. And then here's kind of what you're seeing at the bottom there. Just our final data types for each data frame. So whereas before we had, 4 floats and 5 objects, now we only have 1 object with some DID. That's the unique identifier for each scooter. There's nothing really we can do about that. They're like huge strings and whatnot. But everything else we kind of like converted to the most efficient data type possible for this analysis. And then here's just kind of the final printout .head on the May pickle file. Just give you an idea of our final data frame, what we were working with to do this analysis going forward. Also like to point out too, we changed the company names to integers. So before, Bird, as an example here, went from just Bird to 0, Lyft was 1, so on and so forth. It's kind of maximizing our efficiency with that. Okay. Then our findings. So kind of like what we all came here for. What did we find, and what was the answer to the question that we asked? One of the things we had to look at was, are these companies complying with the ordinance that Metro Nashville offered? Here we have a little snippet from Bill 2018-1202 that says companies need to clean and process their data before they report it to Metro Nashville. This included removing things like service data, trips that lasted less than 1 minute, making sure that trips reported lasted no longer than 24 hours. When it comes to complying with this portion of the ordinance, there are definitely some companies that were better than others, as you'll see here shortly. And then here's our kind of non-compliant trip data percentage chart. The black represents the amount of data for each company that was not in compliance with the ordinance, right? So as you can see here, Bird in particular was like a real big, violator of this part. So was Bolt. Only about 40% of Bird's data was in compliance with the ordinance and therefore kind of useful, really. About 7,000 trips total lasted more than 24 hours. About 9,000 trips lasted less than a minute, and about 80,000 trips had a distance traveled under 3 meters. That was one of the other requirements, a trip to be considered useful, I guess, had to go longer than 3 meters distance-wise. And then of those, so like of all the non-compliant data we're looking at here, which companies are the biggest contributors to the non-compliant data, right? So Bird, as you probably guessed before, a real big contributor to this one. About 68% of their data was contributed to the non-compliance total. And then Lime, 15%. Also like to point out here, you only see 4 companies because the remaining 3, their percentage was, that contributed to this was so small it really didn't even show up on the chart. So it didn't really include them, for that reason. And then some further issues with our data quality, as you can kind of see here. Let's see. Had a real big problem with kind of go over this in a second. A powered unknown scooter. That was a SUM ID, so that's the unique identifier for that scooter. Basically what that's saying is instead of like all these scooters having one unique identifier, a group of them were just kind of like lumped together, powered unknown, weren't reported correctly. So for this Bird scooter group, I guess, we couldn't really properly analyze its movements, so on and so forth. There's also a jump scooter that had an unusual amount of rides in May and June. So in like May, would have been ridden about 20 times a day, which is, as we'll kind of go over here in a minute, definitely higher than average. And then in June, ridden about 43 times a day. And then July, all of a sudden, it's just not there anymore. So basically, as you can tell from here, Bird was a huge problem in terms of data quality. Pretty much they're a big contributor to every slide. And then some companies have some other issues too. But, and then here's an example of the powered unknown I was talking about with the Bird scooter. So this one ID for what's clearly, let me try to So this is like one ID for what's clearly several scooters. The lines represent trips from one place to another. If there's no line involved, that's just like the scooter sitting there, static activity, right? So, if this were properly reported, you'd see, up here, probably like at least 50 different colors probably. But instead, it's all just lumped together into one. We can't really analyze its movements correctly. It's just kind of an example of what we were looking at, and it's kind of like that for, I think this is the month of June. It's like pretty much the same picture for May and July too, as well, with the powered unknown problem. And I'm going to give it to my partner Julia here.
Thanks, Sam.
Yep.
All right, so let's turn to current use analysis, just exactly what it sounds like. When and where are people going on scooters right now? This analysis was both part of a larger question about density, and it also includes answers to particular questions that our city planner asked us, right? When they presented us with the original problem, they had some additional questions. It wasn't just, what's density? Like, what should our density be? It was, hey, we want to know about other things. We want to know about hotspots or areas of greater use, and we also are interested in seeing use within the promise zone. And we keep mentioning that, but I'll get around to it, define it more accurately, and kind of go into what use looks like there. Before we move on, does anyone want to try to guess like peak times or days of the week when scooters might be more popular? Does anyone want to like throw out an idea of when they think scooters might be used more?
Weekends, Saturday 8 p.m.
Saturday 8 p.m. That's very specific. Have you done this before? Okay, I'm gonna help you out, right? One of the reasons that this analysis was asked for was because there are a lot of myths, or possible myths. The city planners were worried about sort of the perception that the scooters have as being touristy or like for out-of-towners only. And so they wanted to see if that's actually how they were being used or if it was something that locals were using for commuting. So let's kind of file that away. I like that Saturday 8 p.m. is very specific. I love it. So, instant gratification, right? Look at this, right? This chart is for every month analyzed which day of the week had the most scooter trips, Saturdays being the highest, weekends is kind of concentrated on the weekends, right? So, again, this was, I don't know if it was disappointing to them, they didn't express disappointment about it, but it kind of does confirm that, hey, it's used more on the weekends. Could just be because there's more traffic in the higher, like the popular areas, but that's what we saw. The next thing, this is the distribution by hour of day trip record numbers. So again, you see it peaking towards the end of the day. If you don't speak military time, I don't speak military time, so I had to look this up. 0 is midnight, and 23 is 11 p.m. So as you see, it kind of peaks around 20, which is 8 p.m. Very nice. Like that's why I asked if you had done this before, because it really was so specific to actually the correct answer. So this is what an average looks like for times of day and days of the week over an entire month-long period. But what about things like holidays and special events, right? So we might expect more volume of people, and so we might wonder if we need to have a greater volume of scooters. If we're trying to get that perfect density, maybe we need to try to work to make sure that that's adjusted for times when there's going to be more people around to use the scooters. We had one of our teams actually analyze several holidays. We got lucky, right? We got July, we got May, June, and July, right? So May has Cinco de Mayo, June has CMA Fest, and of course, July, we had July 4th. I'm only showing you one of those, just for the sake of brevity, but you can see here, this is 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. on June 9th, which was a Saturday, or no, excuse me, a Sunday night. And this is another Sunday night in June, just average night of, same night of the week. And you can see that the activity is dramatically higher. The difference between the two of these charts are staggering. There's so much more activity, and the activity goes up further, which is kind of interesting to me. But this is the kind of thing where you see, okay, yeah, we might need to adjust our density requirements in order to make space for people to use the scooters as much as they want to here. Oh, excuse me. All right, so we have a pretty good idea of when people are riding. Let's see where they're riding. We produced this heat map showing trips throughout time over the entire month of May, which is actually the month where we had the highest use. Thinking back to the beginning of the presentation, does anyone remember why May might be higher and then after that it kind of dips down? It's, well, it was one college student in particular. There was a death at the end of May. Someone riding a scooter was hit by a car and killed towards the end of May. And so once you got into June and July, City Council was starting to talk about banning scooters. They were imposing more restrictions. Things like helmets became a requirement. And so you saw you saw that the amount of youth scooters we're getting through June and July was actually getting a little bit lower. So a lot of the times when we, not every single time, but a lot of the times when we analyzed the whole month, we did show May just because it's a higher use. And we felt that it was more representative of what sort of unrestricted scooter use was, rather than artificially depressed by events where people might be feeling like, oh, this is not safe. So this right here, I'm gonna go ahead and push play on this. And it should start going. This is over the entire month of May. You can notice that the majority of the activity is sort of restricted to right in the downtown core, with a little bit coming down towards Belmont, right? So we might see, and then down to Berry Hill for some reason, right? What's on Berry Hill? Is that where Lipscomb is? I don't know, but there's kind of this hot spot down there too. A little bit up into East Nashville. Right, but you're seeing most of the activity concentrated like right down that downtown corridor, and then into sort of the what is it, 21st Avenue South neighborhood, kind of Midtown.
Restaurants and bars.
Yeah, restaurants and bars, which is a great way to like bar hop, right? I mean, you're not supposed to use them as transportation that way. You're not supposed to use them inebriated, but that's how a lot of people think to use them, right? So one area that you don't see getting a whole lot of scooter use is everywhere around the middle, which is where our promise zone is. So I keep using that term. This is what a promise zone is according to the Promise Zone Nashville website. Effectively, there are areas and communities that are impoverished but have been identified by the local government as targets for direct and concrete improvements for economic activity. The city planner, their specific interest in promise zones is to provide strategic, useful alternative transportation to people who, for example, might not be able to afford their own vehicle, right? So people who use public transportation as a normal matter of course. There's hope that scooters might be able to bridge what is referred to as the last mile gap, which is sort of, as Sam talked about earlier, sort of that last mile between you and the bus stop. Right, your house and the bus stop. You might not live next to a bus stop. I don't. Or your job might not be next to a bus stop if you have to take public transportation. How do you get that far? Or if you're really lucky, right, between your house and your job. I lived close enough to my work one time where I couldn't walk there, but I also didn't want to like take a car. And this would have been a really useful solution for me had scooters been available at that time in my life. So I could see that working. So this is just sort of a general map of that area. As you can see, the downtown area is kind of left out, but it's sort of that big area around downtown. This is a little bit more clear. You can kind of see the road maps. And the promise zones are broken down into sort of 6 individual zones. And what this person did, this is the month of July, so a different month, not May. But he broke down the average trips per scooter and just the number of scooter trips that occurred in that zone during this month, right? And so there are some things you can point out, like zone 1 here. I don't know if you can read this, so I'll read it out to you. It's kind of small. The average trips per scooter was about 75 trips per scooter in that zone, which is not terrible. It's not amazing, but it's not terrible. Whereas in zone 5, right next to it, we have 140 trips per scooter, like twice that number of scooter trips. So you see, but then once we get around to here, so those are the 2 highest. Once we get around to zone 6, all the way over there, 15 rides that whole month. 15. It's like, I mean, that's not even 1 a day. Over here, 39. Zone 4, just kind of way out that direction, right? They're not really getting anything for their rides, and so that's something that we need to look into. If the city wants the promise zones to get more activity, they're going to need to look into what's happening here. So this is an interesting map, and I'm going to pull this up separately because it's right here. So this is a little bit of a more granular look. The creator of this particular map decided that within the promise zones there were even areas that had greater and lesser use. Pardon me for a minute. And so he decided to like dissect it even further, and he divided each individual zone into smaller rectangles so that he could analyze the use within those really specific small areas. And so he used the size of the circle to indicate the average number of scooter trips per day that were originating in that zone. The opacity of the circles indicates how many scooters were available to be used during that month. Okay, the blank rectangles, you notice them down here around the outskirts, they had less than 25 scooters available in the whole month, so he just left them out for the sake of clarity. He also listed idle time, so like if you mouse over any of these and click on them, you can see the idle time. So like this is one where there's a lot of activity. The idle time is only 3.5 hours. That's the amount of time from when one scooter trip ends to one scooter trip starts again. So that scooter is not sitting around for very long. It's being used frequently. You'll notice that the number of scooters available is fairly low, but the daily trips per scooter is pretty high. It's almost 7 trips per day, which is actually pretty good, as we're about to see. Lower than those abnormal trips that Sam was mentioning, several thousand a day. It's obviously a mistake, because this is like good scooter use. Right, this is really highly efficient. I want to draw your attention to a couple down here where we see where a density problem could, like this is an indication of where proper number of scooters can contribute to good efficiency. This is Berry Hill. This is right just north of the 100 Oaks Mall, if you're familiar with that area. Their idle time is about the length of a business day, 8 hours. Which is kind of good, right? You could see people using this as a commuting vehicle. There's only 50 or so bikes in this area, or scooters in this area, and the approximate daily trips per scooter is 3. We're gonna get into what the city defines as efficient scooter use, but this is pretty close to it, right? But right next to it, there are way too many scooters. 374 here, but they're sitting around for 85 idle hours on average. That is days. That's way too many scooters. They're not getting used very frequently. Their approximate daily trips is 0.3, which is really sad. This is where we start having problems that Sam had been talking about, where scooters are blocking traffic, they're not being stored properly, right? They're not getting charged when they're needed. So we're having problems here. So this map, I think, kind of gives a good idea of why there's a problem with the density and why it needs to be controlled more regionally. So let me get back to the presentation here. All right, so the last thing, and this is last but not least, right, because our city planner really wanted to know about promise zones. This was something that was really important to him because he wanted to know about the bus routes. He wanted to know if people were using scooters as that last mile of transport. So this is scooter trips with bus stops. All the yellow dots are bus stops, and all the red dots are the starting point of scooter trips. Okay, we didn't want to clutter it up with too much lines. It's already pretty cluttered. As you can see, the inner areas, right, are kind of cluttered. Even over there where zone 5 is indicated, it's almost obscuring the yellow. Right, and that's where we see a lot of scooter use. You might remember from previous maps. There's a lot of scooter use in that area. So it's possible that people were using it for that intended purpose. But as you get further out on these arterial, like you'll see out here in zone 4 and in zone 3, we've got some big arterial bus routes with very little scooter activity of any kind. Definitely not centered around those bus routes. So it looks like that's really not what's happening. People are not using the scooters at all, let alone for last mile transport. So we did bring this to their attention and suggested that they might need to try different tactics to try to get people to know that this was an option for them and to make sure that there were scooters available for them. Alrighty. So I'm guessing you probably want to know what we actually recommended. In the ordinance, we had to look up and find what their ideal scooter efficiency was. I posted the whole thing here for reference so that you don't have to read it. It's more than 3 trips a day. Okay? That is what is efficient scooter use as defined by the city of Nashville. It varies by city, by the way. Other major metropolitan areas that have scooters have defined different amounts, right? And they base it on different things. New York City, I think, if I remember correctly, were they the ones that based it on like per square mile? There was a city that did per square mile density requirements. But here, efficient use is considered more than 3 trips per day, with a trip being defined as a distance traveled of greater than 3 meters, right? So we're not just going from here to there, we're going far enough to be considered like a useful trip. Alrighty, so one thing we did investigate, because we were interested in looking at companies and looking at which scooter companies might be good for Metro to want to pursue in the future, right? They had been, at the time that they presented to us, they had expressed that they were thinking of kind of paring down and only courting a couple of different companies. And so we wanted to present them with companies that we thought had a greater data integrity, maybe might be easier to work with, were more in compliance with what they wanted. And so we came up with this. This is the efficiency sort of ratio of each company in relation to each other. As you can see, Lime is doing really well. Higher efficiency ratio here is good, right? So 61% of their scooters, roughly, were actually getting 3 rides or more a day. And then it kind of cascades down from there. So that's what this chart is kind of talking about. Now, how does this break down across the city? Really badly, right? This is the average rides each scooter is getting per day across each of these months. As you can see, May was our highest month. But in general, it's a miserable failure. We don't even get to 1, let alone 3. So basically, we knew that we had to recommend that the city really prune and restrict the number of cities to match current use. And if you think back to the heat maps, to that map of the promise zone that was showing where the greater use was in relation to the number of scooters, we realized that we should do it regionally. So we wanted to calculate for each zip code how many scooters were needed to hit 3 rides a day, hopefully. So this is our basic recommendation. The way that we got to this, we went for the zip codes first, which is on this side here. So we calculated the total number of trips per zip code to look at the percentage of trips taken within each one. Based on average use, this works because each scooter is getting about 1 ride each day. A little bit less, but let's be optimistic here. So to look at a specific example, zip code 37203 contained 45% of the total number of trips within our given time frame. We found that because there are approximately 1,500 scooters in Nashville, we calculated that 45% of those scooters were in use in that zip code, which comes out to about 2,600. Then we looked at the utilization rate of scooters in that zip code, which was actually extremely low, right? Way too many scooters. So even though there's lots of rides per day, they're just not all getting used very much. So we tried to use that utilization rate to figure out what we would need to get each scooter to meet current use. And then we multiplied it by 3 so that each scooter could get 3 rides a day. We then added all the numbers of the scooters we calculated for each zip code. There's a couple down here that got 0 because they had so little current use. Right, this is one thing where these were the outer reaches of the promise zone. This is where if you wanted to have additional campaigns to try to raise awareness about scooters, you could eventually add more scooters in here if you saw that there was going to be sort of a groundswell and get people more interested in using scooters, but they weren't included in our recommendation. We added all these up to get our total number there. Another thing that we did recommend is that the city keep an eye on the allocations of scooters periodically to make sure scooters don't migrate out of high traffic areas, right? That's what scooters do, they move. That's what they're for, they go on rides different places. What we didn't want to have happen is 500 scooters in a really high traffic place, all driven out of that high traffic area, and only 300 of them returned. Then there's not enough scooters there, and all those scooters are congesting the areas of lower traffic. And so we said, hey, you might periodically want to go and like restock your high traffic areas and make sure that the zip codes that need that higher density are getting it, the zip codes that are gonna be congested by that higher density are getting to be relieved of those extra scooters. We suggested tasking the operators with this, because they're already picking up the scooters to charge them and then putting them back. So saying like you're assigned this amount per zip code might be something that they could do. And something that could help enforce that. And then sort of where are we now? This is an update, right? So this analysis was performed in 2019, late 2019, September. But a lot has happened since then. We've actually had 3 out of our 7 scooter companies that have dropped out of the market completely. They just left us. They decided that they didn't want to be in our market anymore, and they are no longer operating in Nashville. We only have 4 left. You can see their name up there. Further, there's a new bill that's currently up for debate in City Council right now. It would cap scooter operators in Nashville to a maximum of 500 scooters each. You will note that the total number of scooters, if all the operators participate fully, would be just shy of the number that we recommended. We expect that if this bill goes through, we would probably see changes in about July. The other thing we did is we did reach out to our city planner to see if he had any commentary or anything that he might be able to update us on. And what he told us is they are, in addition to this bill, they're working on an application for companies that want to bring scooters to Nashville. And because this application is not public yet, it hasn't been released, he couldn't comment on the specifics of it. But he did tell us that it is going to be informed by influenced by our recommendation to balance scooter density by region rather than having a recommendation for the entire area. So that's in the city rules. They have a very, down to what kind of data type they wanted it to be reported as, and what format they wanted to have it in. And so that was not something included, but I think that would be a really interesting and important thing because it would allow us to track, as you say, the safety of those scooters. There was nothing in ours to indicate, for example, the speed of a scooter at the ending of its trip, right? So it didn't track overall speed while the scooter was in motion. That would be one way that they might be able to indicate that there would, if it was going 12 miles an hour and suddenly stopped versus it slowed gradually. That might indicate a collision, but that was not something that was included in our data type.
So on the data for birds specifically,
Yeah.
the issue that you guys ran into, where you weren't able to track some of that because of that identifier, was that separated from the compliance issues that they were showing being the most contributor to it, or how did you guys determine that they were the most, what were the data points that basically said these guys are the least compliant? How did you kind of come up with that?
So mainly just looking at what was required in the ordinance, so having to clean the data, trips that lasted less than 24 hours, something went more than 3 meters. So basically kind of what Metro was saying, hey, operators, before you report this data to us, it needs to fit, these specifications. So that basically just points to which companies are ignoring it pretty much, and Bird's kind of
But I'm wondering if that is skewed by the fact that Bird has more scooters. And it's not about the company.
Well,
That's not very even.
I mean, maybe they have more scooters, yeah, but they still aren't, abiding by the ordinance, so just because they have.
I guess what I'm trying to understand here is that Bird is just a company providing the scooters. Sure. But it's the consumers who are using the scooters. So if the consumer decides that they're going to go in a zone that is not allowed, I guess what I'm trying to understand from the data perspective is why is Bird having that number compared to Lyft, which does the same thing. They use the scooter there, and the consumer will go and consume or just use the scooter.
Yeah, so it's just basically just kind of speaks to what are they reporting the right data to Metro, basically.
Quality of what
Data quality, so.
So there's a couple of, first of all, this is percentage, so this does not necessarily indicate that Bird has more scooters, and therefore, they do actually, if you're familiar with the data set, Bird has the largest number of scooters, I think, followed by Bolt and Lime. They had like a large number of scooters, but this is a percentage of their data that was bad. Now, there could be a couple of different reasons. It could be that there's a problem with their reporting. It could be that these companies scrubbed their data before sending it in properly. Like they just eliminated the, because what we were looking at was, are you in compliance with the ordinance that says you have to remove these things? And so they may just have not bothered to remove it. And this wasn't necessarily a commentary on them having bad data, but them reporting data that they shouldn't have. And so the way we saw it from a business perspective is these companies are easier to work with because they're already doing what they're supposed to be doing, or it would be very easy for them to remove the things that they're not supposed to be reporting. Whereas these companies might be harder to work with because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not in compliance with the ordinance right now.
And then you mentioned in another chart that Bird was like second place in overall efficiency. How did the data quality you ran into earlier affect that?
This guy right here.
Yeah.
So
this just speaks to like how many scooters are being ridden 3 times a day, right?
Uh-huh.
So it's just looking at kind of like one part of the ordinance, right? And saying who's the best at, hitting the 3 times a day ride, not necessarily looking at like everything data quality wise as a whole.
Okay.
Too.
Just what you could analyze, that's what you found.
What's
Yeah.
the denominator here? Is it the number of total line scooters or the total?
I think this was the total number of scooters. Yeah. So of the total scooters, 61.74 were getting the 3 rides or more a day. Yeah, and then I remember I did a little bit of like data checking with this to see if there was a big difference, and the percentage difference was not huge. It was pretty close. I don't remember if this chart was calculated before or after the data quality issues were like widely known amongst the whole class. There were 2 specific teams that worked on data quality issues, and we tried to disseminate that information as quickly as possible to the whole class. But this chart may have been produced prior to that, but my understanding was the percentage shouldn't change a whole lot, even taking into account data that shouldn't have been there, right? So like there might be one scooter that had a trip that was 0.2 minutes long that was counting as their 3rd trip, right? But those are few and far between. Most of those cases that was their very first trip that period of time. And so it wasn't really affecting this. It wasn't getting those scooters to above the 3 requirement.
Yeah, I have a question if you ever found any scooters in unexpected locations. I'm thinking of 2 possible things. Either they're, like, I didn't see anything of, like, scooters being in the river. But also maybe places that shouldn't be, like, on greenways or anything like that.
I mean, as far as like the one I remember, like I think we found like a few like all the way up in like Goodlettsville one time, which is weird.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't like remember any like specific like in a river or an alley or something like that. I mean, I'm sure there were. Like, don't get me wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Part of the difficulty here apparently was they had a difficult time geofencing in the downtown core. So it's possible that things ended up in the river, but that we didn't know it because the location wasn't as specific.
Yeah, so I'm really not familiar with the data set. So again, my question is, was this data set being reported independently by the companies? For example, Bard would send you the data set, Lyft would send you the data set, or and now if each one of them was sending you separate data sets, what did you do to make sure that there's some form of standard so that one data set?
So each company, the way this worked, like each company reported their data to Metro,
Okay.
and Metro is like came to us, and so like Metro basically like took the data, combined it into one, and gave it to us.
So they combine it with one
Yes.
data set.
So like Metro did that, and like we kind of like you want to like slide back to the beginning or whatever, kind of like show 'em, like the way it came to us.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it came in
Pretty much
looking
like
like this. And this was really specifically defined by that ordinance that we mentioned right here. This is one section of the ordinance, but like down to the names of the columns and the type of data and the format of the numbers. Like so like the SUMD ID has to be in this specific, like it has to start with powered and it has to have like a denominator after it and it has to be unique to each scooter. So they were really specific about it, and that enabled this the city to really kind of compile this data for us. That's
Okay.
how we were getting it.
I have a question.
Yes.
I saw there's only one latitude and longitude. So is the start point?
Yeah, this is idle or not idle data. This is static data. So in this particular case, this is I think the latitude one. I think this was the start point.
So how do you know how far it's traveled?
We got a second data set
Okay.
that was Tripp's data set. We didn't want to blow up the time here and show you every single thing we did. This was one of the problems that we had. We also got a data set that had start point and end point and gave the specific route that trips were taken. That's how we were able to produce this guy right here. And this is actual maps of individual trips taken using that trip data.
Questions about the promise zones? If you could go to those, while they're finding those. Two questions. One, were any companies more prevalent in or not in promise zones? Was that found? And then two, the second question, the recommendations density. I don't know the zip codes well enough to know. Is the recommendations going to reinforce the lack of scooter density in the promise zones? And what, if anything, is city doing about that?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, like to my knowledge, no, there wasn't really like a prevalence of like one company versus another in promise zone areas, right? And for this one, as far as like scooters being, so to me, it speaks to like an infrastructure issue, because there's not really, like in these promise zone areas, there's not really proper infrastructure for people to ride scooters safely on the street to get from one place to another. Like it's pretty much road, no sidewalk, not really a lane for a scooter or a bike lane or anything like that. And honestly, another kind of thing that I kind of thought of is they're wanting to like reinforce this in, poverty, more poverty-stricken areas. That's what the promise zones kind of are. So if I'm somebody that is on a fixed income and I have to spend, segment my money or whatever, am I really gonna, pay the, $2 or whatever it takes to ride a scooter on one day, or am I gonna save that and combine it into spend on something else, that I may need more? Can I just tough it out and walk from this endpoint, from where I work to this bus stop, or do I really need to pay the however much it costs to take a scooter from there every day too? So.
Yeah, to expand on that, sort of the way that we viewed it is we eventually base our density recommendations off of current use, which is to say that we did not bulk up the outer reaches of the promise zone in the hopes that those scooters would be used. We said, look, this is what the current use is. Maybe in the future, when we can increase awareness or figure out what it is that's keeping people in those areas from riding, maybe we need to offer a discounted scooter pass with a bus pass. Right, so if you buy a bus pass for a month, maybe you get a discounted scooter ticket with that. And then you can use them in conjunction with each other or something. Maybe they need to have an additional program to raise awareness or to increase usage and then bulk it up. But we determined that just based on current use, there really wasn't a need to have scooters out there, and they were not meeting the needs that were there. And so there was again another last mile problem, right, where there was something being lost in translation, and so we needed to do something additional in order to encourage scooter use first, and then to bulk up the scooter density in those areas. Yeah.
So one last thing.
Yeah.
Are scooters supposed to be on the sidewalk or the road?
No, they're supposed to be on the road. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a in the ordinance, you can technically ride scooters on the sidewalk in commercial zones, I think. People are riding them on the sidewalks in downtown is definitely not supposed to happen. It's illegal according to the ordinance. But part of the problem you run into, again, as Sam was talking about infrastructure, right? There's no bike lanes. It's scary to be riding it on the road. There may or may not be a sidewalk. There may or may not be a bike lane, and you don't know where you fit if you're a scooter rider and you're from out of town, and so people tend to ride them on the sidewalks because it feels safer, but they're not supposed to.
Especially when you get further away from downtown, most roads are it's gonna be one lane only too. So downtown, kind of like the heavier areas, there's usually 2 lanes. So if there is, you are riding on the road, you're not necessarily holding up traffic or having somebody just down your throat the whole time while you're riding it too, so.
So one last question.
Yes.
And this is around the data set. I guess the first question is how big was the data set? And then the second question is there things or are there features in the data set if you had, probably you could have got better insight or that you can give recommendation to this Skoda provider so the same.
So like here's a side, like each data, we got a data set for each month we analyze. So like here kind of speaks to that, like they're all about, at least 2 million rows data.
Oh, and by the way, this was the
That's
this
the
was the
static
static
data.
data. This was not the trip data.
The
The
trip
trip
data was like
different.
way more manageable than that, but like we got the trip data I think like a week before or something, like we actually presented it. So the majority of the time we were working with the static data, which is kind of why we included this. But it was huge, like especially for us. I don't know if you were here at the beginning, but like we did this in Python. We just kind of like we had only been working with Python, our knowledge, for about 2 weeks. So like kind of like this was a big kind of just the size of it all was a big challenge for us to overcome, right? So there's that. And then can you repeat what your second question was?
The second question is, are there specific features within the data set that you think if you had would have given you better insights that you can share with the stakeholders?
So like what she was talking about earlier, like speed, I think would be one. Kind of like that would like help evaluate the safety aspect of all this.
Although scooter, like in some ways, scooters are capped. Like they can't go over, I think, 14 miles an hour. I want to say, like, and the maximum speed is capped. So like if you do go over, I think 15 miles an hour, it's defined in the ordinance. But I think they're not capable of going that fast. And so that is something that's, I'm not sure if that would be as useful. At the time, I'm trying to think back and remember if there was data that we looked at and said, oh, it would be really helpful if this data, I can't recall something specific. Do you remember?
I think the speed.
Okay. Yeah, the speed. Sorry. Terry was a classmate of ours as well. So yeah.
So I had a couple questions on the promise zones as well.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you looked at how the population varies between them. And because I'm wondering how much those trip counts would change if you're looking at the population density of those zones.
I don't think that that's something that we took into account. As I recall, I think we were trying to work within the data set that we had been given, and so that was not something that was part of what we were given. That would have been an interesting sort of side thing, but I don't think that that's something that we investigated. But that actually could be something that they could include in the data to help analyze this. I'm not sure if it's something that they would probably want to include in the ordinance as like a regular thing that needs to be reported, because that's not really something that the scooter companies are going to take into account. And that's where all of our data was coming from, effectively, was the scooter companies, the operators in Nashville. That would have been outside data, but that would have, you're right, that would have been helpful in helping us to interpret this here. I can tell you that right over here, because I did look at this in more depth when I was looking at this. Well, here, let me pull this up again. And I can just show you, turn off, let me do it here. This zone right here, that's a big residential area, right? It's a neighborhood. So even though they've got, what was it here, let's see, 3 trips per scooter and only 54 scooters in there, right? It's probably got a fairly high population because it's a lot of residential. And so that is an area where you expect there to be a high population, you'd expect there to be more scooter use, and it's kind of lower. So that might help. Like you can kind of see that a little bit here. But
Question.
yeah.
Sorry.
No.
It was also on the promise zones, and I was wondering if you looked at any of the demographics for that area, because if those areas are higher poverty, when you have to have the right scooter, you have to have a cell phone so that you can like. So what's the age breakdown? Like who is most likely to have a smartphone in this area? Like, or do they even have resources to have a smartphone?
I do want to point one thing out. It's hard to see here. Let me do this really quick because you can see it better on the. If I turn this off, think about this area right there where it's really there's a lot of use there. I'm gonna turn that off. Where is that? East Nashville. Right? Who rides scooters? Hipsters. And so, like, I think that we did not look at demographics because, again, data set that we were given. But those were things that were actually discussed in different groups. You know, my team talked about it where we said, well, maybe people aren't using them because they don't have a credit card. Maybe they don't have a cell phone. Maybe they're, you know, you might have pensioners out here who are older and don't feel comfortable. My mother-in-law lives on 3rd and Demumbrian. She's like right in the middle of downtown. She does not feel comfortable getting on a scooter. She's terrified of it. She's worried she's going to lose her balance, even though she could pretty much do every single errand she could ever want to run on a scooter because of where she lives. And she's just really not sure about them. If there are a lot of people that fall into sort of her age cohort in that area, they might feel similarly. So there could be a lot of reasons. What we eventually came to the conclusion of was that was the city's job to determine what the reason, and we even suggested to them, I think, or at some point, we talked about it, Mary. We did. My team did. We talked about the possibility of maybe they needed to do some additional studies or something to see more about the reasons that could be causing that. That was not for us to determine. We were to look at what the use was.
Yeah.
And what was actually happening.
Like, now that I think about it, like, to answer your question, like before, like the demographic information, like, would definitely be something that could be included with this, because like I remember like Metro was like really interested to see, you know, what the current usage in Promise Zones were, like to do that last mile kind of thing, like connecting people. It's like kind of like seeing, you know, especially now once we saw that it's not really kind of like getting used the way they wanted to, like what are the ways, you know, we can market to these people, these scooters, so that, you know, we can accomplish these goals, right? So like that could be like something for sure that, you know, I mean, they're a government entity, they probably have like, you know, some sort of demographic information about where people live in Nashville, so yeah.
I think from a like safer scooter use and just to promote scooter use, I think it would be interesting to know kind of like you said, like who is the typical scooter user, right? Like gender, age, like what do they do, what do they look like? And then also I think the other type of data is like what is required to use a scooter, right? Like you need the infrastructure, you need a credit card, you need a cell phone. Like you need to be within a certain number of distance. Like I think those two kind of having that background would be very, very useful, which I'm sure you guys have. And